Hi again then guys, and welcome to another specific breakdown of a car from the Gran Turismo Sport roster, and this one is of course not a recent update. In fact, it's not an update at all in a general sense. It's a car which was in the game from day one, and it's a car which kind of falls into that weird category, and even more strangely, also another Volkswagen falls into this category as well, of having a racing version in the game, but weirdly enough, no road car. Because, of course, as well, the Beetle, the Group 3 Beetle, also obviously a Volkswagen, does not have the road car in the game. Likewise with this Scirocco, we do not have the road car, which is really strange, even more so in fact than the Beetle, because of course the Beetle is a completely new car to the game in that generation, whereas we did have a Scirocco in road form in Gran Turismo already. And the changes don't just end there, because the next one that I'm going to mention isn't necessarily as weird as those. It's more just an interesting change, because of course this version of the Scirocco is technically not really a real version, because it's not the N24 or GT24 class Scirocco that was in GT6. It's a very, very similar but slightly different version, which is just, in a general sense, a Group 4 car, to go up, of course, against stuff like the Megane in particular, but also plenty of others too, and kind of weirdly again, even up against stuff like the Veyron in the Group 4 category as well, although of course the cars can vary wildly depending on balance of performance, and that is really where something like a Megane or a Scirocco can have a big advantage over something like a Ferrari or a Veyron in that same category, because just as you would assume, those cars are running huge disadvantages compared to their normal spec. I mean, given a Veyron 500 horsepower, even in its peak Group 4 form, is nothing compared to what it started with, whereas for a Scirocco or for a Megane, having what this car does have, which incidentally is just under 360 horsepower before you've even done anything to it, that's a huge step up, even compared to something like the Scirocco R, which of course was on GT6. Now, I know a ton of people love to use the Megane in particular, but this one also has a ton of potential. It is, of course, front-wheel drive. Volkswagen made the interesting choice, let's say, of making even the Scirocco R a front-wheel drive car compared to the all-wheel drive, the trademark all-wheel drive, you could say, of the top-of-the-line Golf range, be it the R32 Mark IV, Mark V, or then what would become the Golf R, instead with the smaller capacity turbo engines, but still all-wheel drive. And I would argue that that's part of the reason why those Golfs are so good. And it's not just the case that they have more power than the GTI, it's much more than that. They've got a much larger capacity, more power, more torque, but also that all-wheel drive launch and grip, which means that if nothing else, you can just put the power down better. And of course, with something like the Mark IV, the difference between the R32 and the GTI was pretty huge. You could quite justifiably argue that the Mark IV GTI is pretty much the worst of the range. But I digress from the Scirocco, because it was a strange choice, I think, to have a front-wheel drive R variation. All-wheel drive would have made it a monster. So it seems kind of strange that they didn't do that, but at the same time, it does make it a very direct rival to something like the Megane, which again makes it even more strange that we don't have the road-going Scirocco, because we do have the Megane road car. So again, very weird, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if they filled in that gap and brought the Scirocco back, probably the Scirocco R. The Beetle, I think not so much. I'm not expecting a road-going Beetle anytime soon, or even a Group 4 for that matter. And I don't think that will bother too many people, given how good it is just as a Group 3 car. Now this one, apart from the impressive power, has good specs across the board. It's running nearly 300 pound-feet of torque, 2-litre engine, and it's not overly heavy, not too surprisingly. It weighs 1,050 kilos, so that's really good. You can drop it down to about the same as the Veyron in its fully tuned form, 945, but obviously under most circumstances that's not really going to apply, because balance of performance, as I said, so unless you're in more of a custom lobby, of course that won't really apply under most racing circumstances, but not necessarily all. The horsepower per tonne is pretty good. Well, actually it's very good for a hot hatch based vehicle, 341, but with such a low amount of weight. Again, not surprising. The category obviously It's Group 4, we already mentioned that, and the price tag, just like all of the others, is 350 grand, which is interesting because the advantage of having a generalised price tag for each of the categories, which most of them do, it's an advantage from the point of view that it has a levelling effect in terms of affordability, and it makes something like a Veyron feel like an absolute bargain, or a Ferrari. But for something like this to cost 350 grand, yeah, that seems like a lot. For a Scirocco or a Megane to be basically SLR money, real life SLR money, that's a bit ridiculous. But in the long run, it's probably not something which would annoy most people, and it's not really difficult to earn 350 grand in the game. Of course, I've put tons of tunes out where you can earn that literally in one race, so you could buy one of these every 10 minutes or so if you wanted to. So the pricing doesn't really matter, it's one of those little nitpicks that I have with the categorizations within the game. It goes beyond just Group X, but stuff like the fact that the cars all arbitrarily cost the same, which is understandable but not necessarily fair if you want to look at it that way. Not fair to the cars themselves to all cost the same, but I understand why they did that. In terms of handling, for instance, on this car, I would say that the racing versions of the Scirocco, be it this one or the N24, or really GT24 car from Gran Turismo 6, definitely have a huge advantage over the road car. And that sounds like an obvious thing to say. Of course, it's a race car. But many race cars have similar underpinnings and similar handling to the road versions. For instance, the racing Nissan R35s do kind of feel like the road car, because the road car is already so good, and some of the race ones even have very similar handling characteristics to that full all-wheel drive car anyway. Something like a Super GT RX-7, for instance, from REM and Maya. It definitely feels like an RX-7, and various others too. The Scirocco and also the Megane, and the Trophy Megane even more so, they feel worlds apart. And of course with the Megane it's mid-engine rear-wheel drive, which is worlds apart from the road car, but even with this one, it's still front-engine front-wheel drive, but it feels so different to what the road car would be like. And unless you've played Gran Turismo 6, you won't have much of a reference for what I just said, but if you have, and if you've driven the road-going Scirocco R, you'll probably know what I mean, because that car is good, but it's not great. It's got a lot of power and a lot of torque going through the front wheels, and it has a tendency to torque steer and be quite heavy, which is of course expected with front wheel drive, but there are many cars that aren't that bad. Hondas, for instance, the Integras, the Civics as well, even something like the Ford Focus ST or the RS, they are not as heavy as the Scirocco, which is one of the reasons why really I didn't use it that much. The race one though, it's worlds apart. It's one of the most beginner friendly race cars as well. Front-wheel drive helps a lot with that, but it's just a good handling car anyway, and with any front-wheel drive car the diff settings make a very, very big difference, from driver to driver, track to track. As a general rule, I would say that for this one, try to use it on tracks which have a mixture of straight line and cornering, because it's actually surprisingly good in a straight line actually compared to even stuff like the Ferrari and the Veyron in this category, again because of their neutered power. And for somewhere like here at the Nordschleife, it's a really good choice to go for. It's an interesting one, there's no road going counterpart, which in a weird sort of way does make it feel that little bit more special, so yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.